Alright, now we're going to talk about races. In all fantasy settings, you have the same basic lineup of races. You have humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, half elves, and half orcs. All of these have various bonuses to their abilities. Some races actually have penalties to their bonus. Humans and half elves actually get to choose any class that they wish. This goes very well in for multi-classing, which I'll get into in the mechanics video. Now, racial bonuses are going to be things like dwarves get a bonus to constitution, and they get a bonus to strength because they're short, they're stocky, they're born from the stone of the earth. They're not quite as charismatic because they tend to be gruff, they tend to be very blunt, forward. Although this can be changed by some people. For instance, in my games, I have a house rule that if you want to, you can have a dwarf that's very charismatic, just not quite as dexterous because they are short, stocky, got blunt fingers and whatnot. Elves get a penalty to their constitution, but they get a bonus to their intellect and their dexterity. Again, you can trade. I have a house rule that trades some of these stats out if you want to play an elven fighter and you don't want to risk the constitution penalty. Every class is better for some races than others, although there is no one class that can only be played by one race. Anybody in any race can be of any class. The easiest way to choose what race you want to be is to choose what you want to be perceived as. And that goes all the way back to character concept. Part of this also has to do with your class choice. You know, there aren't a lot of sorcerers in Dwarven society. There's not a lot of wizards in Dwarven society because typically dwarves aren't very welcoming of magic as far as a lot of settings go. They are very commonly a devout people. There are going to be a lot of clerics, a lot of battle priests, things of that nature. There's going to be warriors, there's going to be paladins. Wizards and sorcerers are very rare among the dwarves, although the elves, they are abundant because elves living for centuries, they love all sorts of things that take talent. You know, swordplay, fencing is a huge thing among elves in a lot of campaign settings. Magic, they love the beauty of it, so they study it for centuries at a time. So there are going to be more elven sorcerers and bards and wizards than there are going to be dwarven. And the stats reflect that. Now, like I said, some DMs will house rule out the stats so you can play a dwarven bard with a better than average charisma. Now, one thing that you want to try to do is you want to play against type. And playing against type means instead of being the stereotype, like the gruff, dour dwarf, play a jolly dwarf. Play a dwarf who likes to get drunk while he's riding on the horse to the next town. You know, have an elf who's very grim and dour and, you know, doomsayer most of the time. Play a human who doesn't know, you know, who's not confident in himself. Play a half-elf who doesn't like anybody. Play a halfling who's not chipper and happy-go-lucky. Play a gnome who doesn't like messing with technology or alchemy or things of that nature. Play a half-orc who's intelligent, well-spoken. You know, do these things. Play against type. It makes a more interesting character than I'm Harmon, the dwarf fighter, and I don't like anything. You know, it gets boring after you see 20 different dwarf characters who are all the same. Instead, be Harmon, the dwarf fighter who loves to go into a bar, buy a round for everyone because he's happy. He's got the gold to spend. Play against type. It will make your character so much more memorable, and you'll actually have a better time role-playing it. And honestly, playing against type will make your DM happy too, because now he's actually got somebody he doesn't know what to expect with. Now, I've mentioned house rules a couple of times already. House rules are essentially changes to the core rules that a DM will make for his specific games. I've got a handful of house rules. For instance, I mentioned the changes that you can swap out a penalty for a bonus. And I did that because I had somebody who wanted to play a dwarf sorcerer once, but he wasn't overly pleased with the fact that dwarves take a penalty to charisma and sorcerers spell damage and spell levels and things like that are based on the charisma score. So I decided that, if he really wanted to play a dwarf sorcerer, I'd let him swap the two out. It was a one-time thing at the time. Then I just got to thinking, how many people would be willing to play more characters like that if they were able to swap the stat that was important for that class out. Another house rule I have is I always provide my characters with a handful of items to start out with. I always start them out with 50 feet of silk rope. I give them a light source of their choice, be it a lantern, a torch, ever-burning sticks, anything of that nature. I give them a backpack, a couple of days of trail rations, bedroll, things of that nature. I also give them any class tools for free because I figure if they're a rogue, they're going to have thieves' tools. If they're a cleric, they're going to have a holy symbol, things of that nature. Also, for people in my games that actually do a well-written backstory, if they mention a family heirloom, if it's non-magical or has a very minor magic on it that has no combat applications, I will actually give them that item for free. For example, I had a character one time, an NPC, that had a sword that had very fine filigree on it. And when you would look at the filigree, it would actually flow out across the blade and form words that describe the deeds that this sword has done and the various wielders of the sword. It was a very minor magic. It was a glamour more than anything else. But it basically told the history of the sword, and only when you focused on it would it show up. And it had no combat applications. It was just a family heirloom sword that was very well taken care of. It was a very finely made sword, and the NPC had it because it was their family sword. I had another character who wanted to adventure out with their parents' old staff. Didn't have any charges left in it, but it was carved with arcane runes up and down the length of it, and it was just a family heirloom that they carried with them for luck. So things like that, if you run the game, think about things that players ask you about. Think about house ruling in how you want your ability scores rolled. Think about maybe swapping some of the penalties up for some of your races to open up more class options. Anything like that would make the game more fun for your players or easier for your players to get into. Those are the type of things that you house rule.